Welcome all back for the privacy, security, and competition session. I've been told that this is going to be the most technical session as things just ended off, and I hope that it will be both technical but still accessible and informative to everyone here. We have 4 really great talks. What we're going to do for the organization of this is following each talk, there will just be an opportunity if you have some really burning or clarifying question that you want to ask, then feel free to ask that one question, but we're going to cut off at maybe one question. If there's 2, maybe I'll be slightly flexible, but then just move on to the next presentation. But I will try to allocate ample time for the audience to ask questions following all these talks. So you'll get a chance to get your question in. And starting off, we're going to have, my phone closed off. Daji Landis, from NYU, who's going to be presenting security versus interoperability arguments, a technical framework.
Can I get my slides right? I have the clicker. I have the power. Okay, yeah, so this is going to be a little bit different, and I'm afraid that it's going to be a bit of a, I don't know, different tone than some of the other stuff. It's a little technical. I promise I'll be gentle. I am at the Courant Institute at NYU, which is the CS math department, but my co-authors have both computer science and law backgrounds, so this is sort of an interdisciplinary paper, which is sometimes a little hard to do. I don't think I need to convince this audience that antitrust is an important goal. With the CS people, it's a little different, but here I think I can take that as a given. And as I'm sure a lot of you have seen, one of the remedies that is frequently, mostly I'm thinking of the DMA here, but one of the remedies we see a lot is interoperation. And of course the companies don't want to do this, right? Like it's against their bottom line. They don't want to do it. So they will go to security arguments to push back. So this is saying like, oh, this will undermine our security. We can't do it. It's not safe enough, all this. And here's some examples of these things. Please don't read it all. These are all in like public facing documents. We haven't seen this really used actually in the legal proceedings, but these are public facing documents, you know, like, oh no, the DMA is coming for your security, you know, talk to your representative, whatever. So this is what it looks like. It can be pretty hyperbolic. Unfortunately, I'm not here to tell you that you can just ignore it. Like it would be a nice, easy presentation. Here I am, representative of the security community. You're good to go. Don't worry about it. Unfortunately, these can be real issues. Sometimes interoperability is not good. An example that's not antitrust related, but still kind of in that vein is the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So that was not a data breach. I think that's kind of a common misconception. It was not a data breach. It was a breach of contract. So Facebook allowed access for researchers to all this data for research purposes. Great, like it's interoperability, maybe not exactly that term, but you know, something like that. And it was abused by Cambridge Analytica. Again, a breach of contract, like they were breaking rules, but it does show that there is like capacity for interoperability to be abused. On the other hand, sometimes the security community really doesn't want to do the things that the lawyers want, right? So the best case for this is the FBI San Bernardino case. The FBI wanted access to, like backdoor access to the operating system. Apple said no way. Security community pretty much agrees. So this isn't so cut and dry. Unfortunately, I can't just stand here and say like, don't worry about it. But also, these arguments are being used to push back in a way that is often, although not always, inappropriate, hyperbolic. And so as your friendly representative of the security community, I'm here to help out. And this framework is both for the security community to sort of understand the econ and the law background, and for the econ law people to understand a little bit more about the technical side of these things. Although I won't go into that much technical stuff in this presentation. If you want some of that, please talk to me. I love talking about it, or read the paper. So I'm going to go through structure of interoperation, which looks like econ, don't worry. And then a little bit about how these arguments, how they're structured. We have a framework, it's nice. And then also a little analysis. Okay, so the structure of interoperation, this is basically the same as a lot of stuff from econ, so it should be nice and friendly. But I do not actually mean an economic relationship here. I mean sort of a technology relationship. So by horizontal, I mean when you have two pieces of technology that need to come together. Here we have the little train tracks, they need to come together. This would be like messaging, right? So I have an iPhone, you have an Android, I need my messages to go to your thing. They need to be engineered to come together. And this is horizontal, these are economic substitutes. This is all kind of related, but also at the technology level, there is something horizontal going on. Similarly, or conversely perhaps, there's like a vertical situation. So this is, oh, I have an app that needs to run on your phone, this kind of thing. Again, this is sort of the same thing as terms like vertical mergers from econ. Like none of this is all that unique. But what I am saying is there's a relationship in the technology where my thing needs to run on your thing, not just like you are the gatekeeper economically, but you are also the gatekeeper in some sort of technological sense. But again, this is pretty much analogous. So like there's subtle differences between the economic and technological relationships, but nothing we need to go into in a 15-minute talk. So this is our framework. Well, my animations aren't well. So we have engineering concerns. These are the horizontal, this overlaps with the horizontal case. This is, I need to build something to come together with you. This is messaging. It's pretty simple. And so the security versus interoperability arguments. So when the companies are arguing against this, they say, okay, building this is hard, is impossible, is not going to preserve our security. That's what the argument looks like. And then we have the vetting concerns. And this is about policy. So this is, if you make us, say, allow side loading apps or all of these app related things, this is going to be bad for security. Our policies are going to be circumvented. We can't have the same policies. This is going to be risky. So that's what these two concerns are. And the vetting concerns, this is in the vertical case, right? So this is a very easy, nice little binary here. Except that sometimes you have arguments that have components of both. And this is actually, I think, the most interesting case. Ta-da. So we call these hybrid concerns, but they're very much not just like an interpolation of the other two. And one thing that's specific is they are also always vertical interoperation cases. So this is, again, a platform. You know, I am completely mediating your ability to get to your users, right? So it's the platform. But they would, like the interoperation and the concerns both involve engineering and vetting. So this tends to be when you have some sort of proprietary access to hardware. Easy example for this is something like Apple Pay. So Apple Pay requires more access to hardware than, say, Fortnite does. You have to have access to the antenna and to secure things. And so this is hard to do. Opening up these functionalities is a hard thing to do, and it's hard to do securely. And on top of that, you want to vet who has access, this extra access, right? So you have actual engineering that has to happen, actual vetting that has to happen, and then you have the opportunity to make arguments about those things that need to happen. So that's what the concerns are like. And you know, big surprise, this is when we really see self-preferencing or something a lot like self-preferencing, where rather than wanting to keep someone like Fortnite paying fees, you want to keep someone like, say, Bank of America completely out of competition with something like Apple Pay. Here's some examples. If you want to have an in-depth discussion of WebKit, which y'all might not even know exists, please see the paper, or I'm also very happy to talk about it. But this is what we're looking at. Engineering concerns, messaging. The vetting concerns, this is in-app payments, App Store stuff, etc. And then the hybrid concerns tend to be something related to hardware. So a little bit of analysis. Here's another example of one of the engineering concerns. This one's from Meta. And again, these are public-facing arguments for the most part, not in legal proceedings. I know I'm talking to lawyers, so trying to be careful. So these are the ones that are easiest for the security community to study because it's a lot about building things. And there is a substantial literature about these things. There are very good papers, tons of very good papers about end-to-end encryption and how hard it is, especially when you have other functionality like disappearing messages and stuff like this. Like, this is not an easy thing to do. And you see this where, for example, Signal has declined interoperating with WhatsApp, at least for now, because they don't like the security setup. So this was a remedy from the DMA, like WhatsApp has to enable interoperation. Signal's like, nope, no thank you. So this one is, I think, the sort of the easiest one from the security community perspective, which is it's hard. So that does not mean that we should not do it, right? I'm not here to say that security trumps antitrust goals. It's just going to be hard. But it does get more interesting in the vetting concerns because, and I think the first speaker this morning was talking a lot about these. These are the App Store things. And again, this is where the platform has more power. Like obviously, if you're monopoly in size, you have a lot of power. But if you are a platform, you completely mediate third-party developers' access to users. So this is a instance in which there's more economic power. And then also where the security concern's a little squishier, right? So these are policies. And the real kicker is that, of course, someone like Apple wants to keep everyone in their walled garden, both for security reasons, like I want to keep Fortnite in-house or in my walled garden, because then I can keep an eye on their security. This is legitimate. Also, I want to keep them in my walled garden so I can extract fees. But of course, these two things are not one and the same. You can continue to have good security policies and change your fee structures, right? So to sort of suggest that I can only have both or neither is just false. Like you can do good security vetting and not have any fees. I mean, maybe that's not economically all that good, but you could do it. There's no reason from a technical perspective you can't do that. So this is really, I think, the thing to look at here when you are seeing these types of arguments about the vetting concerns that, okay, are they actually at odds with what the third-party developers want, right? Fortnite doesn't want to, or Epic doesn't want to avoid Apple's security vetting process. I've never seen them say that. What they want to do is avoid fees. So here, the thing to look for is this conflation of the two issues. The hybrid concerns are a little bit tough because this is sensitive technology. It is difficult to build the access that some of the use cases would require. It should be done carefully. Also, if you have banking apps and stuff like that that are acting like credit cards, you don't want to just let anybody in. If it's Bank of America, sure, that's a good thing to have if they have a carefully constructed app and they know what they're doing and they're actually Bank of America. That's a good thing to have. If it's just some random app pretending to be a credit card, that does not seem like a good idea, right? So this is sensitive technology, some of it more so than others. Some of the other hardware things are less sensitive, but the credit card emulation stuff, I think, is pretty sensitive. We want that to be secure. So that means there does need to be vetting and engineering. That does not mean that it's impossible. And also, we have to pay attention to the incentives of the companies. And of course, the incentive is not just to extract fees, but to block access entirely, right? So much of these, they really want to keep their monopoly over this sort of secondary good like Apple Pay and something like that. So here, following or paying attention to the incentive, again, is very important. You're economists a lot here, so I don't think I need to belabor that point. But also, the technology is very sensitive. That doesn't mean we can't do it well, but it does mean that it is difficult, and a lot of the concerns, while overblown, are not completely baseless. In conclusion, pretty much the engineering concerns are hard to do. It's a hard thing to do. That's just the fact. But again, that does not mean that we should not do it or that the security concerns outweigh the antitrust goals. It's just simply a hard thing to do. And also, computer scientists are not, it is not foreign to them, this idea of trade-offs. Security economics is a subject. This isn't something new in my field either, but there will be trade-offs. With the vetting concerns, really, the fees, the fee structures, and the security checking do not need to be so tightly married, but the vetting should still be done. This is an important thing to do. I do not think we can just sweep this issue under the rug. And then with the hybrid concerns, it's just a difficult engineering task, but also one where the platforms have so much power to prevent competition that they don't want. Am I on time? Excellent. Well, I'll end it there. Do I wait for questions here?
Does anybody have any burning questions? Okay, with that, then let's
There's a
just,
guy- there's-
oh, sorry about that. Hey, Eric.
Oh, someone wants to hear about WebKit?
I have some opinions about WebKit. So, I mean, you teased the WebKit thing. What do you think the vetting concerns are in the browser area?
None.
Okay. That's what I thought too.
Yeah, well, because I think that what Apple does is they sort of they act so there's a requirement that so WebKit is a browser engine. It's a piece of a Chrome app on your phone. And they sort of act like somehow WebKit is more secure when there's no suggestion anywhere that it actually is. I don't think anyone thinks that, but they require it for no apparent reason. Please read the paper.
Thank you, Daji. Sorry, am I squeezing you too much?
No, we got it.
So we have kind of a tight squeeze for people to get up to further talk, so hopefully we will not trip anybody. We have Jerome, who's present from DuckDuckGo, who's going to be presenting some work by some of his colleagues on anonymizing search, click, and query data while maintaining utility.
I also appreciate people talking about WebKit. Hi, everybody. The fact that this has been described as a technical panel is pretty terrifying because at best, I'm a recovering lawyer. As was just said, this presentation is actually covering work on behalf and conducted by Andreas Davis, who is a privacy engineer at DuckDuckGo, and Paul Francis from the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. So if anything is confusing or I start sounding like I'm saying gibberish, it's not their fault. It is my inability to convey their work. So, I'll say this at the end. We're talking about this paper today because we are very interested in folks' feedback and we'd like to engage with folks on what is maybe a little bit of a niche topic. But we do think that this is a topic that supports data sharing remedies that are relevant right now in both the United States and the EU. So to level set, Article 611 might be an underappreciated component of the Digital Markets Act, but it introduces an obligation on search gatekeepers, of which there's only one, to share anonymous ranking, query, click, and view data. So we call that click and query data. This can help search engines and arguably AI platforms improve their search results and improve their ability to generate information, especially for less frequent queries, which we call long tail queries. A similar remedy requires the use of or requires the sharing of what's known as user side data as part of the Google search antitrust case in the United States. We believe that for all practical purposes, this data in the EU and this data remedy in the United States are synonymous. And thus, as a result, this work is applicable on both sides of the Atlantic. So before I discuss our approach, I want to address a basic issue with explicit user identifiers in search data. So at a baseline, we believe excluding both direct and indirect identifiers like cookies, like Google IDs, that can link together search histories, search sessions, that those should be excluded as a baseline. We have found that Google is very keen to obfuscate this fact. If I had any hair, I'd be pulling it out because Google continues to cite the infamous 2006 AOL search log case as an example of the dangers of this type of data sharing. Our argument is that this is an example of immature, unsophisticated, and arguably irresponsible pseudonymization. It reflects an effort from 20 years ago. The state of the art in de-identification has advanced considerably since then. And so constantly seeing this AOL search case example brought up over and over again is really frustrating. The lesson from this is, as this New York Times article points out, the lesson is to remove user IDs, not search queries themselves. Google has taken the opposite approach and the opposite lesson from this debacle. In the EU, Google has announced what's known as a European Search Dataset Licensing Program. You can do a search on DuckDuckGo and find out information about this right now. This data set that Google makes available under the as their effort to comply with the DMA provides no real value to a competing search engine. And this is due to Google's proposed anonymization method, which only includes data that meets two thresholds. The most important one that I'll talk about is basically Google's position is queries must be searched more than 30 times in the last 13 months by 30 separate signed-in users. That's a lot of different numbers, but basically the end result is that any query that isn't incredibly common is excluded. And that's all of the long tail queries that are valuable to search engines. We extrapolate that Google's data set admits more than 99% of distinct search queries. That's a tremendous amount of search queries. What remains is literally things like Wikipedia, sports. These are queries that everybody sees because they're very, very common. And the data from this obligation is in those rare long tail queries. To sort of also illustrate the disparity between these sort of common queries and rare queries, while 99% of distinct queries are removed, or rather more than 99%, this methodology ultimately excludes 42% of Google's total search volume. Now, Google doesn't share its own estimates here, but we think that really these numbers have been backed up and supported by evidence that was put forward in the search case last year. This is the definition of malicious compliance. I really can't put it better than the DOJ's witness. At every turn, Google's approach to this compliance obligation of the DMA has been one that you would use if you didn't actually want to release high utility data. That's sort of absurd for a company with Google's resources and technological sophistication. One of these highlighted lines right here is that Google was not deploying techniques that are taught to undergraduate computer science students. So, this is not a security or privacy decision. This is a policy decision that Google's using to undermine the DMA. We believe that the European Commission actually agrees with us. This was announced just last week that the European Commission is going to be providing more guidance over the next 6 months to help Google with its Article 611 compliance obligations. So we've got this ongoing specification work in the EU, and I think that that's why this proposal that I want to talk about is especially timely. The fact that the EC has also weighed in like this ultimately suggests that they're rejecting Google's current approach. So Google's tacit assumption really is that any unique query that anyone makes is identifiable. And well, it's not even just that. It's that unless a query is made 30 times, it's identifiable. And that's incredibly broad. So I have an example here. If I type into a search engine, do Kellogg's cereals have GMO ingredients? Google would exclude this on privacy grounds, despite the fact that everybody can make this query. There is just no basis, I think, in computer science that a generic query like this could be re-identifiable to an end user. I think this is actually, frankly, further supported by joint guidelines that were released last year from the European Commission and the European Data Protection Board. They emphasize that the goal of anonymization should be to protect the data of end users. In other words, if any of you out there right now are searching Joseph Jerome to learn a little bit more about me, that is not personal data for purposes of Article 611 of the DMA. It's not personal data under the GDPR. Google will continually claim the opposite. And so I want to elevate that, again, names alone are not necessarily private information, but even if you are concerned that people are going to get information about names being searched, our proposal actually excludes queries that include names. So taking these joint guidelines into consideration, which discuss some of the click and query obligations, we're arguing for proportionate and effective anonymization We believe that that does not require eliminating every possibility of re-identification. Instead, re-identification needs to be difficult enough such that the cost of large-scale data mining of all of this click and query data far outweighs any benefits, and that the probability of actually being able to re-identify a specific known user target is low enough to discourage reasonable attempts to do so. So to back this up, we think it's necessary to have alternatives to Google's approach. So the remainder of my time, which I hope I haven't taken up half of it already, is going to be spent talking about our targeted filtering approach. Our approach removes less than 99% of distinct queries versus Google's proposal, which again removes more than 99%. And so this involves targeted filtering, generalizing metadata, and implementing frequency-based word filtering. This is based off of DuckDuckGo's own data sets, which are not the same as Google's, though there's probably some differences there. But a key finding that I think is relevant or an important takeaway for this group is that PII, personally identifiable information, is relatively rare in a search query. And potentially problematic PII, that's information like a name that's also combined with an address or provided with additional contextual information, is even rarer. As you can see, these percentages, aside from names, which again, that seems something people focus on, it's less than 1%. So what do? Step one, we filter known identifiers. I think that, again, that goes back to the AOL search case. We get rid of email addresses. We get rid of phone numbers. The graphic on the right sort of shows what the resulting queries would look like once you take out known identifiers. You should see a lot of X's there, things that are just taken out of the queries. The next thing that we do, and I think what is novel about our approach, is that we propose to filter out unknown and uncommon words. This contrasts with Google's proposal. So Google applies a threshold to an entire query. The queries aren't identical where you're going to just throw them all out. Instead, we look at each word in the query. This captures things like accidentally pasted passwords, other types of PII that are not immediately obvious. So we apply this threshold, and let me go through this example here. So is blah, blah, blah in REI hacked passwords? If we tokenize each of those words and we run it against a dictionary, only REI and blah, blah, blah are going to be flagged. Now, REI is a US retailer, so it's probably going to hit some sort of threshold that suggests it's not actually that rare. Or even if it's an unknown dictionary term. And so then only the blah, blah, blah is likely to be missing from a dictionary or something that's commonly searched. So we've flagged an unknown and uncommon word. It hasn't made it through any sort of filtering process. So we're going to throw out that query. Applying both of these filters, we get rid of known identifiers. We look at unknown or uncommon words. You apply that to both data sets. And it results if you have 1.5 trillion searches, it results in only 1.69% of searches being filtered. Importantly, if we apply both of those filtering methodologies, they remove all of the potential PII that we determined in a manual review of our own data set. So those initial numbers that I showed. So the only thing that then remains that we should be worried about is metadata. And there's useful metadata that needs to be provided as part of click and query data. This slide, if you can see it, is a ton of text. I apologize for that, but basically we have a methodology for generalizing metadata using a k=1000 threshold. So for all of these things, location, device type, if it's not in a bucket of 1,000 people, we generalize and expand the pool until it is. We think that that's another way to mitigate privacy concerns. It also does, I think, a really good job of generalizing location data, which if you're a privacy person or a privacy advocate tends to be a form of data that is particularly sensitive. The bottom line here is that if you take these 3 steps, we filter known words, we filter known identifiers rather, we filter unknown words, and we generalize metadata. We believe that this results in the exclusion of only 7.25% of DuckDuckGo's English queries. Using a bunch of fancy math, If you extrapolate that up to Google's volume, because Google has considerably more search queries than DuckDuckGo, it leads to about eliminating 2% of Google's search queries, as opposed to more than 99%. Why is this important? This demonstrates that there are ways to share anonymized click and query data in a way that can be made useful to competitors. Second, again, in light of the fact that the European Commission has announced, a specification proceeding, and we have the imminent technical committee being put together in the United States to produce privacy and security safeguards, that more attention needs to be applied to this information. Again, while it's very niche, I think it's important to respond to and rebut to Google's efforts to make bad faith privacy arguments. As the previous speaker mentioned, to use privacy and security as sort of this impossible shield to, as a defense to anti-competitive behavior, even as they engage in privacy invasive behaviors of their own. And so, I'm happy to answer any questions, both in this panel or afterward. We really very much welcome follow-up. Again, I think, this is our effort to produce a counter proposal to what Google has done, but we'd love to engage other folks in this just to sort of, again, have a little bit more ammunition to go up against Google here. So if there are any scholars, any researchers, any technical folks that want to talk de-identification and anonymization, a very sexy topic, please reach out. I've got my email address here. I'm happy to put you in touch with the actual authors of this work, and we're happy to engage in a dialogue. I want to thank KGI and the Tobin Center for giving us the opportunity to present this, and I will shut up now. Thank you.
So let's take a burning question. Okay, we have one from back there. You're welcome to start to get up so that.
It's such a great case study of how we can decentralize tech. Have you done any re-identification attacks to choose that K equals 1,000 users? How that K value came from?
That's a great question. I don't think we've done re-identification attacks. We just thought that was actually like at a high enough level that it would omit so many people, particularly for the United States. If you have 1,000, different devices in an area, that's unlikely to be re-identified. Similarly, that's a K value that's considerably higher than the K equals 30 that Google proposed for queries.
Right.
So we're making an assumption that this would actually be very hard to re-identify.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you again, Joe. And next up will be Yifei Wang, who will be talking about competition and privacy.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I am Yifei. I am currently an assistant professor of marketing and business economics at the University of Pittsburgh. Today, I'm going to talk about my research on competition and privacy. The key research question I'm trying to address in this paper is whether more competition in the market leads to more or less privacy intrusion by firms. I'm particularly interested in the causality between competition and privacy practices. Now, privacy has become an increasingly important topic in the mobile economy. Based on a recent set of statistics, on average, a mobile phone is located by apps over 3,000 times per day, and our photos and files data are accessed by apps over 2,000 times per day. So these are really scary statistics and suggest that privacy is an important challenge faced by consumers in today's economy. So a natural question here is why are things so bad, and why does it seem that privacy intrusion has become an increasingly important challenge? So regulators around the world are starting to get increasingly concerned that insufficient competition leads to privacy abuse by firms. So for example, in the recent landmark cases in the US, DOJ versus Google and FTC versus Meta, regulators brought up the point that insufficient competition and market power of these big tech companies might actually lead to privacy intrusion. And in Europe, the European Court of Justice recently supported the German antitrust regulators that Facebook had been abusing its market power to harvest user data. So it seems that regulators around the world are now having this belief that more competition is going to help privacy protection. And that belief can be illustrated in this recent New York Times article, which basically reported that almost simultaneously with Google's exit from the social media market, which happened a long time ago, of course, Facebook started to decrease its privacy protection for its consumers. However, there has also been counter-arguments that competition might not be the remedy to the problem. And in this recent research article, the authors argued that more competition will not help if rival firms compete to addict users and to engage users and essentially exploit users. Then competition might be toxic in the sense that the firms might compete for data and better targeting, and that might lead to more privacy intrusion. And also, there has been observations in the media and in the literature that large firms that have a certain degree of market power typically actually have less sensitive data, and then they invest more on privacy protection. So how exactly competition affects privacy is unclear, and despite the amount of media and policy attention, this question is almost completely unstudied in the empirical literature on privacy. So this is going to be the focus of my project. A bit more on the context, I'm going to study this question in the context of the Chinese Android app market. Now, the Chinese Android app market is a bit different from app market in other countries in the sense that in the US, for example, people download apps from Google Play, but Google Play is banned in China, so people have to download apps elsewhere. And a major source of apps is what we call the third-party app stores that collect data from this major third-party Android app store in China, which means that we have a representative sample of apps, Android apps, that are accessible to Chinese consumers. Now, what does privacy mean in this context? So here I'm going to measure the degree of privacy intrusion as the number of permissions requested by apps. So if an app requests more permissions relative to other apps in the same category, then I'm going to think of it as being more privacy intrusive. And that is because the number of permissions generally represents the level of data access and the degree of device control requested by the app. So this is certainly not the perfect measure for privacy, but it is widely used in the literature on privacy. Now, what does competition mean in this context? So here, competition means the degree of concentration in the market. And here I'm going to study a policy shock that both decreased the number of products in the traded markets and also increased the degree of market concentration in those markets. So the key conceptual challenge of this project is how to identify causality. So why is this so challenging? Or that is because competition is affected by many factors, by complicated dynamics. So there might be other variables, a lot of other things, which we call the confounders, that can affect both competition and firms' privacy practice at the same time. So the correlation we observe might not reflect causality, it might instead reflect the common influence from those confounding factors. So the way I address this challenge comes from the sad fact that the competitive market in competitive environment in Chinese app market is affected by internet censorship. So in 2003, China launched this Golden Shield project. And as a part of this project, some of the most popular global websites and apps are banned, such as Facebook, YouTube, New York Times, and many others. But despite the censorship, people can actually still access those banned apps in China for a very long time because they can use censorship circumvention tools, such as the VPNs. Before 2017, people can access these tools relatively easily and use them to access those foreign apps, those banned foreign apps. But in 2017, there was a new regulation that prohibits such tools legally, those tools that are not authorized by the government. And so as a result, it is much harder for consumers to access those banned apps with those tools. So this is an illustration of how this policy change interacted with the competitive environment in Chinese app market. So the top of the figure here represents the uncensored categories. So think about music apps. So think about weather apps or bank apps here. Now, the apps in those categories are permitted both before and after the policy shock. So their competitive environment is not really affected by this policy shock. The bottom of this panel here are the censored categories. So think about music apps or social media apps, for example. Now, banned apps in those categories, so think about Spotify, for example. Now, these apps are banned, but before the policy shock, they can still be accessed with VPNs. Now, after the policy shock, the VPNs are banned. So even though Spotify is still there, people can hardly access it from mainland China because they can hardly access the VPNs. Now, the permitted apps in the censored categories. So think about the Chinese domestic music apps. Now, these apps are permitted both before and after the policy shock because they're domestic. But before the policy shock, they're facing competition from those banned apps, such as Spotify. Whereas after the policy shock, they are essentially experiencing a decrease of competition because people can hardly access those banned foreign apps like Spotify. So in my analysis, I'm going to use the permitted apps in the censored categories. So the guys in the bottom panel as the treated group, as they are experiencing a removal of competitive pressure. I'm going to use the permitted apps in the uncensored categories, so the guys up there as the control group, as their competitive environment essentially remains unchanged. So some quick evidence that the policy was indeed implemented and enforced and affected competition. So the first figure shows the percentage of most popular VPNs in China before the policy shock and the percentage of these VPNs that are removed from the market. So this is a cumulative percentage. So before the policy shock, things are fine, but after we see a huge increase in terms of the percentage of popular VPNs removed from the Chinese market. The second figure shows the degree of concentration measured by Heffendale index. And we see that after the policy shock, the censored or the treated markets have a substantial increase in the degree of market concentration measured by Heffendale index. So the data and model. So the key data challenge is how to get historical data on permissions. So the way I address this is that I find a app store that provides historical versions of apps. And then I downloaded all the historical versions of all the apps in my sample. And so I end up downloading over 300,000 app installation packages. And then I analyze those app installation packages directly to find their permission requests, their app functionalities, and the revenue model. And I also have a censorship data set that tells me which major global websites were banned in China at which point. And then I define a censored app category as those that have major non-Chinese apps that were banned before the policy shock. So method, synthetic differences in differences. This is a recently developed econometrics method. So the key idea is basically, we construct a synthetic control group from those untreated apps so that they provide a high quality match in a statistical sense, so that to compare to the treated apps. So I'm just going to skip the statistics part and go directly to the results. So first, the main results. So here I actually did analysis using multiple statistical methods, but for the interest of time, I'm going to just discuss the synthetic differences in differences results, which is in panel B. So the y-axis here is the log number of permissions requested by apps. The red line here represents the treated apps. So those are the apps in the censored categories. The blue line here represents the synthetic control group constructed from apps that are in the uncensored categories. Now, the solid line represents the announcement of the policy. The dashed line represents the time when we actually observe VPN removal in the data set. So as we can see, prior to the policy change, the synthetic control group provide a very good match to the treated apps, whereas after the policy shock, we see a clear divergence, in particular after the actual removal of those VPNs from the market. So essentially, this shows that the removal of competitive pressure leads to an increase of privacy of permission requests from the treated apps. So here are the numerical results. So let's just look at column 3 and 4. These are the synthetic differences in differences results. Now I look at both the number of permissions and the number of particularly privacy sensitive permissions as defined by Android. So the results are similar. It basically shows that the regulatory trend lead to around 3% increase in terms of the permission requests and the dangerous permission requests by affected apps. So this pattern is quite robust to a series of robustness tests, but I'm going to just briefly discuss two things that I think the most important. The first thing is a robustness tag that shows that the effect is indeed come the shift in competitive pressure. So basically, I look at treated categories where the competition is more affected in the sense that the banned foreign apps used to be important players in this market. So they will have a higher ranking, basically. And I compared them to markets where competition was less affected in the sense that, yes, there were banned apps, but those banned foreign apps are smaller players. They did not rank as high in the Chinese market. So the results basically shows that the estimated effect is larger in treated markets where competition is more affected and smaller in treated markets where competition is less affected, which is consistent with the removal of competition story. Now, the second important robustness check I want to highlight is the question of whether the effect was actually reflecting expansion in app functionality. Because sometimes app requires permissions in order to deliver functions to users. For example, an app might want to access certain data because the data is important to the function. And so while that does not mean that the data does not have privacy risks, it might be less of a privacy concern because consumers might actually want to share that data because they want to achieve to access that function. So here, basically, I look at the proxy of app functionality, which is the number of Android activities. So here, basically, an activity is an Android terminology that is basically a window that user can directly interact with. So this is a user interface. So here it basically shows that the training and control apps do not really differ in terms of how many functions that they provide, which suggests that the increase in permissions is particularly alarming because it cannot be justified via increase in functionality. So some heterogeneity that shows that the effect it comes from increase in multiple types of permission requests. So it's not not a specific type, and it is also shared by multiple different categories. Now, mechanism. So why does this happen? So first thing I want to highlight is that the banned foreign apps are actually on average requesting fewer permissions compared to their Chinese counterparts, which means that the removal of these apps essentially means that removal of privacy-friendly outset options. And that means that the Chinese apps are now having less incentive to compete on privacy, and they are more aggressive in terms of user engagement and monetization. So I have some empirical evidence on both, but in the interest of time, just very briefly talk about the last piece, which is the effect is concentrated among apps that explicitly monetize user engagement. So here, I basically look at apps that monetize engagement via apps, where advertising via in-app purchases, and apps that do not have any specific way to monetize engagement. So the effect only comes from apps that monetize engagement and is insignificant among apps that do not monetize engagement. And I also find that after the policy shock, the treated apps also specifically increase their effort to engage and retain users in terms of the number of SDKs they use to do user analytics and engagement. So that's pretty much all I want to say for this paper. Thank you so much. And this is my email address, so please feel free to email your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
So I see we already have a burning question, so please go right ahead.
Can you explain a bit more on the synthetic control group, like on slide number 25?
Sorry, if you don't mind just getting the mic.
Yeah, so on slide number 25, if
Number 25.
can
This
you-
one?
Yeah, can you explain the synthetic control group a little more? Because in the ads component, the curve of the synthetic control group seems to be like going down in the first ads Uh, yeah.
So that is a good question. So basically, the synthetic control group for panel A and panel B are slightly different in the sense that, so in panel A, both the treaty group and the synthetic control groups are apps that use an advertising model before the treatment. And in panel B, the synthetic control groups are apps that use an in-app purchase model prior to the treatment. So essentially, they are from two different samples. And so this basically suggests that the control apps that rely on the advertising model actually experienced a certain decline in terms of the permission requests without the removal of competition.
So the synthetic control group is just the apps that are available outside China?
Oh, no, okay. So the synthetic control groups are constructed from the set of apps that are also inside China, but are in those categories where they're not, you can essentially understand them as the categories that are not censored. So categories where there was no banned foreign apps that plays an important role in those categories. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, last up will be Thijmen, who will be speaking about, or Thijmen van Gundt, who will be speaking about how Amazon instrumentalizes pets and sidewalks to entrench its infrastructural power.
Yeah, well said. My name is Thijmen van Gundt, currently a researcher at TNO. I'm also affiliated to the Delft University of Technology, where I was before, and did the majority of the work with my lovely co-authors, Donna Bertolfo and Seda Gursis. The title is quite a mouthful, so we'll start off with some background. The premise is that privacy-enhancing technologies, those are the techs we look at, and they are a class of technologies that, at least originally, aim to alleviate power asymmetries by design. Again, a mouthful, but there are two central principles. So first, you minimize data processing or data use to a specific purpose, which is also called purpose limitation. And second, you then consider how any powerful party, be that government or a company or whatever, can overreach, for example, eavesdrop into your communication. That then leads you to come up with a certain technical design, such as encryption, that centers both of these principles in the very design of your application. That all sounds very nice, but we've seen a few contentious applications when companies that have infrastructural control deploy these pets. So on the left are two examples that I've already heard a bit about today, either over drinks or in the room, namely in the digital advertising sphere. Google rolled out Privacy Sandbox in their Chrome web browser. Apple rolled out Apple App Tracking Transparency, which were both supposed to improve privacy in digital advertising, which is much needed, but also remains them, or leads to them being central in digital advertising. So for example, Google said, we plan to ban all use of third-party cookies, which is good for privacy, but they replaced them with certain on-device analytics that they had to set, like they were the browser and the operating system definers. So they got a certain power in the way that other companies do digital advertising. And something similar happened in the case of Google Apple Exposure Notification Framework. This was during the COVID-19 pandemic, when digital contact tracing was the thing that governments wanted. So if I was close to you and you turned out to have COVID later, then I would get a warning in a very privacy-preserving manner. That was all kind of fine. But this had to be implemented on the level of the operating system of mobile phones because it relied on persistent sensing and persistent background functioning. And then Google and Apple, they reserved those privileges to operating system functions, which means that they got a certain influence in the way that public services, namely public health, were delivered to the public, because they got to set the perimeters in which this could happen. They became arbiters of privacy. So what we see here is that pets can provide some privacy to users in what we call the business to consumer context, but also leads to these tech companies entrenching their own role in how other companies or governments produce and deliver their own services, which is the B2B part. And that is the focus of us. So we performed a case study into Amazon Sidewalk to see how this develops, and we had the hypothesis that something similar could be happening. I want to start with the show of hands. This is now the first time that I'm presenting this work in the US, which is the only country where Sidewalk is currently active. So how many of you have heard about Amazon Sidewalk before? It's a lot of a better score than in Europe. How many of you have an Echo or a Ring device in your home? or maybe have people that do. I guess there's a bit of a bias in all of you. I'm happy to hear. Maybe Amazon's less so. Sidewalk is a connectivity service for IoT devices. So the premise is that if you have an Internet of Things device, be it a smart lock, which is on the very left, or an asset tracker, which are more to the right, they need connectivity so that you can control them or you can see where they are. So you can send data to them and take data from them. But connectivity then requires maybe Wi-Fi, maybe a 4G or 5G connection, or all these kinds of other alternatives. And that can be expensive or there can be little coverage. And that is where Amazon Sidewalk comes in. It's a crowdsourced network, hence all these people and the very nice marketing material that Amazon has. And manufacturers of these devices can then make sure that they use sidewalk connectivity and do not have to put Wi-Fi or 4G or 5G into their own devices. So these are all manufactured by third-party companies and not by Amazon themselves, but these companies are adopting Sidewalk. This is what it looks like technically. I had some animations to go a bit easier on you, but you have to listen to me extra carefully now that it's all already on the slide. We start on the far left where we have an endpoint. This is the IoT device that I just showed before. So it's the device that will get a connection. And you want to connect it to what is on the far right. So a laptop or maybe a phone or desktop from the light's owner, so that you can see whether it is on or you can control it. And to get this connection, the endpoint on the far left can then connect to what is called a gateway, so an Amazon Echo or an Amazon Ring device that are already out there throughout the country. And the peculiar thing is that the endpoint can be owned by someone else than the gateway. So my device, my endpoint, can get Wi-Fi connect or can get sidewalk connectivity from your device, which is the gateway. And this is what makes it crowdsourced, that pretty much anyone's device can contribute connectivity. And what Amazon uses here is the fact that these Echo and these Ring devices, they already have an own connection to the internet to function themselves. And Amazon kind of repurposes that bandwidth to then route packets to the Sidewalk network server and the AWS IoT core for Sidewalk. That's more technical, but what Amazon does is they route all the traffic and they make sure that my message goes to my device and that it goes to the application server of the manufacturer of the device. So very technical, but what you have to remember is that the endpoint gets connectivity from the gateway, which is already an Amazon device owned by someone else potentially. And Amazon's web services have a very big role there. That's all the part in orange, which also means that the manufacturer of the endpoints can tap into all the other AWS services that are there quite easily for data storage, for securing the devices, for monitoring all devices out in the fields. So that's quite convenient for them. Amazon claims to have coverage of over 95% of the US population today. So that's very big. They rolled out the service in opt-out fashion, which could explain that not everybody knows about it. And we did a qualitative case study into this. Most important is that we interviewed half of the manufacturers that have adopted it. So now back to pets that I started the presentation with. What are their effects? The fact that Sidewalk is crowdsourced and that my device can use your connection to talk to a server somewhere, of course, led to some privacy and security concerns. And the public reception was not very good initially for Amazon. So this is when Amazon came out and said, not to worry, we have two classes of very good pets. These are quite traditional or simple pets, so not all the hardcore pet engineers think they're pets maybe, but still. On the left, we have a 3-layered end-to-end encryption scheme, and on the right are the fact that Amazon obfuscates identifiers and all the routing information. So when a device talks to another, a lot of the information Amazon clears periodically. At least that's what they say. Those are our details. What you should remember are the bottom two parts. The idea is that the gateway owners, so the people that provide connectivity, cannot learn anything about the endpoint owners, so the people that get connectivity. So any content that is deemed sensitive, like contents of packets that are sent back and forth, those are not visible to Amazon or to gateway owners. That all sounds magical and very nice. Despite that, there are a lot of privacy and confidentiality issues that remain, but I only have 15 minutes, so I will focus on the B2B part today. There are quite some implications for the manufacturers that make IoT devices and that want to have Sidewalk as a connectivity protocol for them. So on the left is the fact that they have to key their endpoints. To support the encryption scheme that Amazon has, they have to change the way that they produce their devices. For example, they have to have a computer with an internet connection in their factories right now. They have to use a hardware security module These are all kinds of small steps that really change the way that they make their products. The second box is that they have to use Amazon-approved chips and hardware, and those are quite expensive. You might wonder about the foot, but the thing is that Amazon's software stack has a big footprint, according to our interviewees, which means that once you adopt Sidewalk, you cannot really fit other connectivity protocols in the same device, which also increases your dependence on Sidewalk working well. And they can only buy chips from the 5 companies that are at the bottom. Only their chips are certified Sidewalk-proof by Amazon. Then once you've jumped through all those hoops, you also have to be certified and audited yourself as an organization to carry the Sidewalk labels and for Amazon to let you onto their network. Remember, because it's all encrypted, Amazon can just revoke your keys, and that means you no longer have access. And the final and biggest part is that you have to use AWS. So all the encryption and decryption ends within Amazon's cloud servers. So you must use that. And if you want to use another cloud service, or maybe a customer using your devices wants to do that, then you have to kind of copy your data back and forth. Which leads to something that we call the pet paradox. So the first facet of the paradox, we think there are 2, it involves flipping. And it's a full slide, bear with me. With these pets, Amazon can very granularly control how data flows. So they can make sure that you can communicate with your endpoints, or that the manufacturer can see how well they are doing out in the field. But it also gives Amazon a lot of device telemetry, which for the manufacturers is useful because they can see, are my devices doing well, or should I improve some parts? But Amazon can kind of see the same information, and it tells them a lot about how manufacturers make their devices. And they also see how they use AWS. And it was already mentioned today, but Amazon did something similar before with Amazon Basics, where they see how others use their platform and then use it for their own. Most saliently, they can now extend their own computational infrastructure. With that, we mean that they first already controlled Amazon's cloud. To those who are very tightly connected to the Echo and Ring devices. And these are now a gateway to also let these third-party endpoints onto the cloud, puts them kind of within their reach. And in this process, they use pets kind of as a marketing strategy. So our interviewees said, and we also saw from the public backlash, that Amazon claims that they are suppressing some data flows and then not talking about all these other options. There are more details about this in the paper, but this is what they use to flip consumer devices. So they offer connectivity and a very tight integration with AWS to manufacturers using consumer devices of people that might not even know. So this conceals how pets can increase informational power instead of countering it. The second facet is that they get a kind of infrastructural power over IoT manufacturers. And infrastructural power we define as Amazon entrenches their own computational infrastructure in a way that these manufacturers produce their device services. Because once you're in AWS, you are incentivized to kind of move all your production in there, because it doesn't make sense to, for example, copy back and forth between Azure and AWS. It centralizes all the choices they are making for you. So you use the hardware and firmware that they give you, but also you go through the certification process and they will prevent any abuse and monitor the whole network and kind of protect it. But it also creates a lot of technical and organizational dependencies. So not only because of the footprint, making it hard to fit other protocols in there, but also because all of these hoops you have to jump through really puts a burden on these organizations that are sometimes very small, or they make devices that should be very cheap, so you should have very cheap hardware on board. And as I just finished off with, Amazon gets insight into business sensitive information. So how do IoT devices work? And that informs their own development. And in this process, interestingly, power begets power. Because when we asked our interviewees why they then adopt Sidewalk if it comes with so many hurdles, many of them alluded to the relationship that they have with Amazon or that they want to build with Amazon. So one said they have an ongoing partnership that they want to foster. Another saw it as a way to create a more intimate relationship with them. Even another one said we just want to befriend the giant and therefore we kind of play ball the way they play ball. And privacy protection, which Amazon says is really a core of Sidewalk, was not really given as a benefit here. So the pet paradox, to sum it up, is that pets reach millions of users and manufacturers, which seems great if you start from the premise that pets can decrease power. But actually, we see that in this specific case, they can increase informational power asymmetries, which to people means that there is now a connectivity network potentially monitoring the whole world, or for now, the whole of the US. And for companies, it means that they are providing Amazon with valuable device and AWS usage information, which they cannot really do anything against. And then the second facet is that it also enables infrastructural power on the side of Amazon. So they get to reshape how companies produce, in what environments, with what processes, and they put down a lot of certification requirements to them. So what then should we do? Let's make it clear that I am not against pets. We are not against pets at all. We think a first takeaway is that we should identify when consumer devices are being repurposed with these kind of privacy guarantees that Amazon's making, actually masks an extractive intervention. So this is what we call the flipping. They use consumer devices, say that there are no privacy issues at all going on, but that kind of sidelines all the economic and the B2B implications. Second takeaway, and I'm really happy that we have such a diverse public here, is that we think we should engage conversations across all affected layers and domains. And that's really big, but if we look at the pets or the engineering community, the people that make these technologies, they could be very happy about the uptake and about the engineering novelty of these kinds of services. They might be worried about what is called privacy washing. That's a bit of an ongoing discussion where they say they improve privacy while they don't, but then you still restrict the discussion to privacy or confidentiality only. Whereas competition is now also an issue. So pets can limit more competition in free markets, but that doesn't really mean that we should abolish pets at large. We don't have answers. There are more questions. You can think about consumer rights. So what about your device being used for another purpose? You can think about governmental sovereignty if you think back to the contact tracing example. And we just really want to give away that we should be having more discussions that kind of unite all these angles. So sadly, no answers, but something interesting and hopefully inspiring. And I look forward to any questions, thoughts, and also comments.
Let's take a burning question while we start to transition to the panel. So actually, I have a quick burning question. So I wonder whether there sort of is this subtle difference here between, so for instance, with the contact tracing case, sort of the pet kind of built the infrastructure itself, whereas in this case, it seems though the purpose of the pet was to almost be a sort of sugar to help the medicine go down. Like it was more of sort of a PR tactic to allow them to build the infrastructure. Do you see there as being sort of a distinction between those two types of cases?
Yeah, I'm very happy you pick up on that. It's a very important distinction. So with the contact tracing case, there indeed was a demand for contact tracing. Of course, there was a pandemic going on. I don't think I have to tell you on the urgency about that. So there was a wish for contact tracing, and then they said, okay, we can do this in a privacy-preserving manner, building on the DP3T framework, which is built by academics, and then they kind of pull that into their operating system. So that kind of solved an issue that was lying around. With Sidewalk, it's more that they thought, or we cannot speak on intentionality, but it's more the fact that they created a connectivity network and then put the pets in there to do that using consumer devices. They were not really solving an issue or a problem before. They created a new service and they just needed pets to flip these consumer devices for that purpose.
Thank you. All right, so please feel free to sit back down. And now we're going to open things up for questions for any of our panelists. So if you have one, please feel free to raise your hands. So. Yeah, if you could just wait for the microphone.
Sorry, just a quick follow for you. So what's the spectrum or the frequency that the endpoint device and the Echo uses? It's just license-free spectrum, Wi-Fi spectrum, or what is the?
Yeah, so they refer to it as Sidewalk, the protocol, which is kind of an umbrella. They have 3 PHYs. It's LoRa, that's one option. The second is Bluetooth. And the third is frequency shift keying. This is quite technical. There are more details both in the paper and in the technical documentation that we used. But it also differs per gateway. So I just said they can connect to Echo and Rings, but not all of these devices have all of the antennas on board to accommodate all 3. And likewise, not all the endpoints have all the 3 antennas on board. So it can differ, but it's usually one of those 3 or multiple of those 3.
I had a quick question for Daji and Joe, just follow-ups. Daji, you had given the example of messaging interoperability as a challenge is primarily engineering in nature. And I guess like my understanding of messaging interoperability is there's a lot of issues around abuse detection and preventing spam and filtering, which seems to me to implicate vetting. And I wanted to kind of wanted you to comment on that challenge. And then Joe, your presentation did, I think, proposed some really interesting new ideas for screening queries. But can you maybe comment on how like a wider array of queries leads to more utility, like not just the privacy side, but the utility side? Is it just that there's more long tail queries, or is it more nuanced than that? Those are my kind of, sorry for the double barrel, but.
So, as with a lot of frameworks, it's not super cut and dry. I think that mostly what we were looking at were instances in which the messaging, all of what we were looking at was instances in which the messaging was either going to be or already is end-to-end encrypted. So then the platforms can't look at what's being done. There are some tools that are good for these type of things, like disappearing messages, being able to check that something's been deleted. This is a good way to, sort of start to help with, say, partner abuse issues. And these are hard to implement and also hard to implement in the end-to-end encrypted setting. Let me tell you that if you want to do AI end-to-end encrypted, you should read Mallory's paper. It's really hard too. So these sort of extra features are just harder. But in terms of like abuse detection directly, that's not applicable because it's already encrypted, at least to my knowledge.
That's a great question, and let me try and answer it by going through some of the use cases for click and query data, because I think that's part of the problem. Like, what is this click and query data, and what can it be used for? So I think the main and most obvious one is it addresses your point about long tail, like understanding more about long tail queries. In terms of practical terms, it's not just about improving search result and relevancy. It could be really useful for building an index. That's like, obviously, if you're interested in search dynamics, is a huge competitive component here, where there's not many indexes available, and Google's is way better than everyone else's. And this has huge implications for the AI companies, frontier models. So it's not just about understanding long tail queries. It's about understanding what parts of the internet to map, what parts of the internet might just be purely spam. Another use case that sort of we've found is that it also would be helpful. Click and query data can be useful for when to fire instant answers. That's actually like part of DuckDuckGo's origin story. Our CEO was like, I want to be able to have instant answers for things. And now we have, all search engines have all these sorts of modules with instant answers. But it's oftentimes difficult to know which module should be triggered. Presumably Wikipedia can be triggered quite a bit, but there are rarer modules that click and query data could help inform. Another thing that can be done is, one thing that I didn't quite realize as someone that grew up at a point in time where I was obsessed with never making grammatical errors when I typed, is that a lot of search queries are just like typos everywhere, or just like, you need to figure out what they mean based off of words that they're misspelling all over the place. And so a lot of times, you have to either sort of figure out what they've actually typed, or you want to suggest some other word to put in there. Click and query data can be really helpful with that. And then I guess the last one that I think will be super relevant for AI companies, and frankly, if you followed the Google case, a number of the AI companies talked about the utility of click and query data in their amicus briefs, and when they were called to testify, is that it will help with basically freshness and web search in chatbots.
So I saw your hand go up next. So if you don't mind just waiting for the microphone. Oh,
Alyssa, I'll go ahead of you. Okay. I wanted to make a comment more than a question, which is that very often the privacy people want to say the thing that Yifei started out with, which is competition's going to drive us all to the bottom. And so that's really terrible. And I just would like to point out that in, for example, the car market, we have regulation about brakes and seatbelts and airbags and crash testing. And then we let cars race to that threshold. And yeah, they're all trying to, make the cheapest car conditional on meeting that quality threshold. But we as a society have decided that's a safe car. So the only reason that competition would be a problem is because you haven't done the safety regulation properly. I really just want to stand up for competition here and say that competition is not, we don't outsource to a monopolist giving us safe products. That's not the right way around. We make the safety standard and then we let firms compete. So anyway, that's not a question. Sorry about that.
any panelists care to comment on that?
100% agree.
Okay, so I think we have actually somebody with the microphone. Wait, Alyssa, you might have the microphone next. And I think that there's somebody else who also had their hand up right around the same time who will come after that. So, and then y'all be third, okay?
Yes, okay. I have a comment and several questions, sorry. Daji, coming back on your framework and hybrid versus engineering. If we look at the DMA, Article 7, which I'm so glad we get to talk about, we have to talk about it every single year we have this conference. So it's a horizontal interoperability mandate for messaging, but it basically has vetting built in because of the structure of it, right? So like the gatekeeper gets to create a reference offer, and now there's companies that go under NDA and decide, and Meta gets to decide if they are up to snuff, if they are like meeting whatever specifications Meta has, in order for the two of them to interoperate. And I think some of that does have to do with abuse mitigation, like Meta vets how the other company does abuse mitigation. And, to the extent they're doing like message franking and these kinds of things, like there is an impingement on interop. But I think it's also just like, are you going to slam my servers? Can you implement the protocols properly that I've said that you have to implement? So I think it's like even blurrier than it seemed maybe.
No, I mean, so part of it is that if you're trying to interoperate with Meta and you're coming with your own protocol, then they have to go check it out. Obviously, they always have to check out some stuff, but if you're using the Signal protocol, then there's less to vet. The vetting case, so the pure vetting case, is also far from pure. You in order to sideload an app, you need to have an API that works. So these are not pure things. The details are in the paper, but the pattern still is very clear where the primary challenge and also the concerns, right? Because the framework is actually general. The concerns for the engineering case are concerns about engineering, right? So that's sort of the main issue with these ones. It's not to say that there's no vetting to be done, but that tends to be not like what the companies are complaining about.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, but it is true that it's much more, I mean, all of these cases are much more complicated than just this. Yeah, read the paper.
Yeah. Okay, I have questions for each of the rest of you, so I'll be quick. And I'll just say them all and then you can take them in whatever order. So Joe, you showed some data both about like the prevalence of PII and then also efficacy. And I'm just wondering, like, why should we trust your numbers? Or have you put thought into like what accountability framework is needed for the public to trust those kinds of numbers? Because obviously you're incentivized to get as much data as possible. So not, your branding notwithstanding. And I'm also curious about query rewriting because that came up a lot in the trial. And like these cases where you have to filter an unusual word, like if you could get the rewritten query or something, is there any corner case like that where you would expand the number of queries you could get if they were rewritten? I don't know if that factors in, but I'm just curious about that. Yifei, this might be in the paper, but you showed some data about apps that monetize versus not, or monetize attention versus not, as well as differentiation between different kinds of permissions requested. And I'm wondering if you also have the cross between those things. Like, is there some subset of apps that monetize and there's like some set of permissions that are most common in the case of the ones that lost competitors? And then Thijmen, I'm curious if you could apply your findings to either of the other two cases that you mentioned at the beginning, the privacy sandbox or ATT. Like if you think about your two core findings, is there some way that they apply directly in the case where you don't have, hardware vendors?
I guess I'll try to go first there. Those are also really great questions. So the first one is why should you trust us? That's a great question. Obviously part of the reason that we're happy to present this is we'd like to get other people engaged on this. For our purposes, so we had a number of our team like do a manual review of thousands upon thousands of queries to just sort of mark out what the PI incidence was. So we use basically we have a 95% confidence threshold that the real number is within 50% of that based on the thousands of queries we reviewed. And so, the limitation here is like we're a small company and this was just someone just like doing this by hand. But after, after they hit that point, we didn't think it was necessary to look at a bigger sample of queries. Now, you're right, that might change things. But that was just a manual review. We have tried to do automated reviews using LLMs to further like see what we find. And similarly, it suggests that the incidence of PII is pretty low. Now we could quibble over whether it's 0.5% or 1% or 1.5%, but there's no evidence that we've found so far that suggests that it's significantly higher than that. Your second question was about edge cases and queries being rewritten. So look, you're absolutely right that from DuckDuckGo's perspective, and I think all of the search competitors' perspectives, more data is better. That said, there are privacy issues here. And, I was mentioning how a lot of our queries are just the same sort of typos over and over again. But there are queries that, it's just someone wrote something that is off the wall and we've never seen that before that would be excluded here because of the way we're doing word filtering. And we think that that's just appropriate as a privacy protection measure.
So thank you so much for the question. I think that's a great question. So basically, I looked at the stratification by monetization model and also by the type of permissions, but at this moment, I still don't have a result that look at the interaction between those two things, partly because there are many different types of permissions. But I think it'll be interesting to look at least for a part of representative types to get an understanding of that. So right now, like one result that I have is that the apps that monetize, they actually tend to request a lot more permissions that are related to push notifications and to personalize those push notifications. So it seems that those apps are really trying to like push users and to repeatedly remind users to engage in them to actually attract user attention. So that is the one result that I do have, but I think there's still potential to investigate some other types of permissions to actually enrich those sites of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. We do see similar effects in these other cases around advertising. There might be less hardware involved, but we see effects on production at large. Interpreting production not just as producing devices, but all kinds of services or products at large. For example, in the Google Privacy Sandbox, we're trying to track users with guessing, stochastics, AI, trying to follow them, trying to interpret who they were. And also using universal identifiers. So logins on websites, for example, across websites owned by the same publisher. So there were really big differences in how they started to do advertising, digital advertising, even though there was no hardware involved. So we do see similar cases. We also have a third case in the paper, which relates to Apple Find My and Google's finding devices. I won't cover it too much here, but there is yet another case that we see the same thing happen. So we do think it's a pattern.
Yeah. Thank you. Next.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question is for Dr. Wang. I find your study very interesting, the relationship between competition and privacy, using the case of China and China's unique, digital market, which is heavily regulated. I was just curious, would you expect a similar outcome or similar finding if you were to look into different authoritarian governments, such as Russia or North Korea? Who are also, prohibiting their public from accessing, they have their own versions of their own platforms, right? They cannot have access to the foreign platforms. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a super interesting question. So I think my knowledge is that Russia now also has a similar type of censorship. Yeah, I'm not so sure about North Korea, but I think that actually would also depend on, what are the privacy practices for the domestic apps in those countries. Because the thing in China is that the big foreign apps, though they have certain sort of market power in the international market, they actually still tend to be more privacy-friendly apps compared to Chinese domestic markets. So this censorship essentially means that a removal of those more privacy-friendly alternative outside options for the Chinese apps. So I think ultimately it would probably depend on what are the standard privacy practices for apps in the other authoritarian countries, and whether they are relatively more or less privacy respectful compared to those banned international apps. But I think that's an interesting question to think about. Thank you.
I think you actually had your hand up next, and then Eric will come after.
Hey, this question is for Joe as well. Yeah, this is a little adjacent to privacy, but I was wondering how important the recency or freshness of query and click data is to competitors. And is this a factor that really differs between like Google's proposals and competitor proposals? Does Google use the privacy shield there to say, hey, we can't release anything for like till it's 6 months old?
Great question. And I'm gonna take the opportunity that you asked me a question to also respond to Alyssa. The other thing of not trusting us is, well, and I mentioned this in the presentation, Google hasn't put its own estimates out. Like, I'd love to see what Google thinks its incidence of PII could be. And we think that that ought to be required to be either public or conveyed to regulators. Now, to answer your question, that is a great question. And it's actually something that we've had to do a lot of thinking about. So right now, under this search data licensing program that Google offers, they provide this useless aggregated information over quarterly periods. And that implicates freshness considerably. Now, I think the optimum competitive way to get this is some sort of real-time pipeline that could raise privacy issues. It could also just raise a lot of cost and resourcing issues. So, our position has really been that timeliness ought to be, again, it can be aggregated by the day or ideally within 7 days. The other like logistical challenge here is, and I can already imagine my privacy engineering team yelling at me that I'm going to say this a little bit wrong, but it's not so much like we need to know an approximate range of when the query happens. And part of that is because the real benefit of this information is to sort of benchmark, here's our results versus Google's results. And so the way, we currently set it up is we don't know what our index and what our results look like 6 months ago. So if Google's giving us data from 6 months ago, we can't benchmark that. Now, if you were to tell us, hey, we're going to give you data over a week in time, let's say, a week in March upcoming, then we can plan for that and be like, all right, we're going to try and take snapshots of what we get that week. So if we know the time frame, it doesn't need to be, real time. It just, we basically need to be able to sync up the data that we have with the time that Google's going to provide it to. And again, our thinking is once it's beyond a week in period, like that raises real freshness concerns. Thank you.
All right, Eric, you're up next.
So I think stepping away from the Amazon case to the other store cases you mentioned, I sense an implicit criticism of the technical work in these cases. And I'm certainly not here to defend Privacy Sandbox by any means. But it does seem to me that some of these cases, the privacy features were essential for making it work. Namely, for instance, the COVID tracking stuff. No one knows how to do that without the privacy features. The same thing is largely true for the Find My network. And in some cases, Privacy Sandbox for its manifest failings, nevertheless did in fact have better privacy properties than third-party cookies. So I guess I'm sort of trying to understand like what the take home perhaps for how does one reap those benefits without perhaps the negative consequences that you seem to see?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Like I said, we're not against pets at all. We think they allow good things. For example, one good benefit of this sidewalk thing could be that you can now remotely update your devices and patch security issues in there. So it's hard to have one uniform stance on this. We can also not say anything about the intentionality of these companies rolling them out. So whether they want to increase their power, I won't say anything about that. In the paper, we have some recommendations, such as we see a couple of centralizing forces in how tech companies currently have their computational infrastructures out there. So the fact that if you want to roll out something like contact tracing, or if you want to do something like digital advertising, you're mostly resorting to Google's, Apple's spheres of influence. That has something to do with what you're seeing here. So we also urge it's a bit of a different community than here maybe, but we urge the engineers and the pet community to look at alternative architectures. So how can you achieve something similar like connectivity that Sidewalk offers without all the centralizing forces of Amazon? And it's kind of a pattern where with many pets that rely on decentralization for the positive sides, there are a lot of centralizing factors at the same time, such as Amazon saying, yeah, sure, we will do the abuse mitigation, but it requires us to do everything on the network. You can think of other setups like more of a mesh networking thing, where not all the traffic goes from endpoint to gateway to cloud, but the devices can also communicate between each other. For example, if you have 5 devices in your home that they can talk to each other without first having to pass through the cloud, that will be an alternative that gives Amazon less power. There could be other privacy or security concerns that come with that, but there are alternatives. We don't really have the answers, but questions like these that you pose are good to answer or to research going forward.
I've been told that we can take one more question to make sure that you all can get off to your break on time. And it looks like we have somebody that's already raised their hands. We're having sort of a nice fight here where everybody wants to give the other person the last question.
This is a question for Yifei. I was wondering whether when you have the the line about the more companies that were banned in the sector, the stronger the effect that you see. Is that a convergence to one level of privacy, of compromised privacy, such that the apps in the least competitively affected industries were already at a higher compromised privacy setting and the other ones kind of caught up to them? Or do you see actually divergence within the 3 categories such that the apps that are in places where the most competition have been removed actually become less privacy respecting than apps that were less affected, their competitive environments were less affected?
That's an interesting question. So like, let me just rephrase it. So you basically are interested in knowing like the baselines of those different types of traded categories, right? The more versus less affected traded categories. But that is a good question. So I don't have the numbers, like the baseline numbers on top of my head, but what I can share is that what I'm essentially looking in this analysis is the percentage increase. So it's basically what I found is that regardless of their baselines, the markets or the categories where competition is more affected, they have a large percentage increase relative to their own baseline, whereas for the less affected categories, they have like a smaller percentage increase relative to their own baseline. Yeah, but I can get back to you in terms of the numbers of the actual baseline. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all. Congratulations. There were even a few complicated looking equations up there and nobody seemed to have their heads explode or anything. So you made it. But yeah, and thank you also to all of our panelists. And I believe that now we have a short break.
So